All right, Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Shai, Bahashum, Racha Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well, and grace and peace to you elect around the four winds, believing I'm pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rakhaya from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And I wanted to get into a brief lesson tonight on the importance of being transformed, you know, by the renewing of your mind. The importance of renewing the mind through the spirit of Yahweh Bahashim Yahushai. Because the average mind is a ghetto. It's no telling what the mind is going to devise, what the mind is going to muse on, or think about. The mind is a ghetto, especially the average mind of a so-called Negro, Latino, or Native. It's no telling what kind of debauchery or what kind of wickedness is going to be devised at any moment. Which is why we have to bring our minds under the reign of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. Under the reign of the scriptures, under the guidance of the scriptures. Because it says in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, it says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" When the scriptures speak about the heart, it's speaking about the mind. All right. The heart in the Hebrew is lab, and it goes into your mind. And it says the mind is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Especially for us, those of us who have grown up here in Babylon the Great. All right. We've been taught a life completely contrary to the standard and the will of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. We've been taught to uh, come up with solutions and think contrary according to the standard of the Lord. How the Lord wants us to think and solve problems. Which is why the mind is deceitful. The average mind will come up with something that seems pleasing to the flesh, but when it comes down to it, it's not pleasing to the Lord. It says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Let me get this. This is Wisdom of Solomon 9, verse 15. "For the corruptible body presseth down the soul, and the earthly tabernacle weareth down the mind that museth upon many things. And hardly do we guess aright at things that are upon the earth, and with labor do we find the things that are before us. But the things that are in the heavens, who have searched out?" It says, hardly do we guess aright at the things that are upon earth, because the mind muses upon many things. The mind will tell you, seven different things at one time. The mind in itself is wanton. It's it's wild. And the only way, to tame and to bring that mind under some form of scrutiny, uh, some form of discipline, is being transformed by the renewing of our mind by the spirit of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai, which goes into Romans the 12th chapter, which we read almost every single week. But there's a reason why the Lord has it coming out very frequently, because the mind is one of the first things that we learn to conquer through the spirit and power of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. And once we conquer this wicked mindset and bring it under the guidance of the scriptures of the Lord, then our lives begin to change for the better. Then we begin to have good success and prosper, like it says in Joshua, the first chapter. Once that mind is subjugated to the will of the Lord, our diets become better. Our way of life becomes better. Our way of thinking becomes better. We become better critical thinkers. We become better problem solvers. We start to promote ways and a way of life that's conducive to our growth. You know, whereas in the world we didn't. We lived in that glorified ghetto that was in our minds. But it says, Romans 12:1, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of the Heavenly Father, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto the Heavenly Father, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of the Heavenly Father. And the Lord told us to be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of our mind. And how do we renew our mind? Well, let's get this in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8. It says, this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then shalt thou make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. All right, so once we order our mind according to, the standard of the Lord, then we begin to have mental, spiritual, even physical success and prosperity. All right. But that transformation comes through the ordering of the mind through the standard of the Lord. All right. And get this. It's a lock here. I'm fighting these damn gnats. Fighting these damn gnats. So I'm trying to fucking talk. Hey, how you doing? Psalms 119 and verse 9 says, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed thereunto according to thy word. And that's how we cleanse our ways. That's how we wash our brains in a sense. Go through that brainwashing is through the word of the Lord. All right, taking heed to the word of the Lord. It acts as a cleansing agent, for the filth that we've accumulated mentally in this world. Babylon has been a very traumatic experience for the majority of us, all of us. And coming out of, that experience, the only way to cleanse ourselves is by taking heed to the word of the Lord, and bringing our minds under subjection to the standard of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai, you know, because the mind, again, is a ghetto. It's no telling what the mind will devise. It's no telling what the mind is going to tell you concerning, matters of importance, where the mind is going to wander, you know. It has to be brought under a constant state of subjection, a constant state of scrutiny, a constant state of examination. And the only way to bring it under the proper state of guidance and examination is by taking heed to the word of the Lord, especially in the times that we're living in now. We want to live, and dwell as much as possible in the spirit and order our minds aright concerning the will of the Lord, you know, so that we're making proper judgments, we're making proper calls concerning the spirit, we're moving and thinking according to the will of the Lord, just like Yahweh Shai, just like our forefathers. But with that being said, I just want to bring this quick, impromptu lesson, something that was mentioned at camp last night. Just wanted to, put something on wax, strike while the iron's hot. Don't let your mind be a ghetto. All right, clean it up through the word of the Lord, through the spirit of the Lord. Take heed to the word. Bring your mind under subjection. All right, bring it under scrutiny, bring it under examination. All right, because it's desperately wicked. And we can't have our minds running wanton, in these latter days. We just can't have it. It just won't work out for us. For those of us who are trying to live according to the will of the Lord, it just won't work. We have to bring our mind under the discipline and guidance of the Lord. All right. But with that being said, shalom. Stay up.